Nestled in the quiet town of Blue Ridge, a small, unassuming diner named Benny's Burgers had become a local legend. The diner was known for its mouth-watering burgers that drew people from neighboring towns. The secret behind the taste was a closely guarded recipe that only Benny himself knew. Benny Thompson, the owner and chef, was a man of few words, with a stern face that rarely cracked a smile. He had been running the diner for nearly 2 decades, and in that time, it had gained a reputation for serving the best burgers in the region. But Benny's success story was not as simple as it seemed. The townsfolk adored Benny's burgers, praising the unique flavor of the meat, which they often speculated was sourced from some special secret farm. However, beneath the surface, Blue Ridge held a dark secret, one that was whispered only in hushed tones and never in the open. Over the years, several people had mysteriously disappeared from the town and surrounding areas. But the connection between these disappearances and Benny's Burgers was something no one dared to consider. One evening, a young journalist named Emma Hayes arrived in Blue Ridge. She was working on a piece about small-town America and had heard about Benny's Burgers from her editor, who insisted she try them. Emma was intrigued by the diner's reputation and decided to make it the centerpiece of her article. When she arrived at the diner, the first thing that struck her was the overwhelming smell of grilled meat, rich and tantalizing, that wafted through the air. The place was packed with locals, all eagerly devouring their meals. Benny, with his thick arms and gruff demeanor, stood behind the counter, flipping patties with an expert's precision. His eyes met Emma's as she walked in, and he gave her a brief nod before returning to his work. There was something unsettling about him, a coldness that seemed out of place in such a lively setting. Emma brushed off the feeling, attributing it to her exhaustion from the long drive. She ordered the diner's famous Benny's Special, a burger that supposedly held the secret to the diner's fame. When the burger arrived, it looked perfect, juicy, thick, with a sear that spoke of a master at work. As she took the first bite, Emma was struck by the rich, complex flavor of the meat. It was unlike anything she had ever tasted, and for a moment, she understood why people raved about it. But as she ate, a strange thought crept into her mind. There was something off about the meat, something she couldn't quite place. It was as if her instincts were trying to warn her, but the flavor was so intoxicating that she pushed the thought aside. After finishing her meal, Emma struck up a conversation with the waitress, a middle-aged woman named Marge, who had worked at the diner for as long as anyone could remember. "So, what's the secret to these burgers? I've never tasted anything like them," Emma asked, half-jokingly. Marge chuckled nervously, glancing toward Benny before responding. "Oh, Benny's got his ways, you know. Says it's all about the quality of the meat. But truth be told, I don't ask too many questions. As long as folks keep coming back, I figure it's best not to pry." Emma sensed the discomfort in Marge's voice, but before she could press further, Benny's voice boomed from behind the counter. "Everything all right over there, Marge?" he asked, his tone sharp. Marge stiffened. "Yes, Benny. Just chatting with the young lady here." Benny's eyes locked onto Emma, and for a brief moment, she felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in his gaze, an intensity that bordered on menacing. She quickly paid her bill and left, making a mental note to dig deeper into the history of Benny's Burgers and its mysterious owner. Later that night, as Emma sat in her motel room, she began researching the town's history. What she found was alarming. A string of unsolved disappearances dating back nearly 2 decades, with no apparent connection, except for the fact that many of the missing persons had last been seen in or near Blue Ridge, and most unsettling of all, some had even been seen at Benny's Burgers. Emma's curiosity was piqued, and she knew she had stumbled onto something much bigger than a story about a small-town diner. Determined to uncover the truth, she decided to stay in Blue Ridge longer than planned and investigate the disappearances further. What she didn't know was that she was about to enter a nightmare far beyond anything she could have imagined. As she drifted off to sleep, one thought lingered in her mind. What if the secret ingredient in Benny's famous burgers wasn't what everyone thought it was? The next morning, Emma woke up with a renewed sense of determination. The lingering taste of the previous night's burger haunted her, but even more disturbing were the thoughts about what might lie beneath the surface of Benny's success. She knew she had to follow her instincts and dig deeper into the unsettling mystery that was slowly unfolding in Blue Ridge. Emma's first stop was the town's small public library, a quaint building that seemed frozen in time. Inside, she was greeted by Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly librarian who had spent most of her life in Blue Ridge. With her silver hair tied neatly in a bun and her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose, Mrs. Jenkins was the embodiment of a town's collective memory. Emma introduced herself and explained that she was researching a piece on the town's history. She asked if there were any old newspaper clippings or records of the disappearances that had occurred over the years. "Oh dear, those were dark times," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice tinged with sorrow. "Many good people just vanished. No one ever found out what happened to them. The police investigated, but it's as if they disappeared into thin air." Emma listened carefully, taking mental notes. "Do you have any information on the specific cases? Names, dates, anything that might help me understand what happened?" Mrs. Jenkins led Emma to a dusty archive room in the back of the library, where she pulled out a few old files and boxes filled with yellowed newspaper clippings. Emma began sifting through them, her heart racing as she realized the scope of the mystery. She discovered that the disappearances were sporadic but consistent, with the first one dating back nearly 20 years. The victims ranged in age and background, but one detail stood out. Several of them were travelers passing through town, while others were locals who had fallen off the radar. The articles were sparse on details, often summarizing that the individuals were last seen at local establishments, with a few specifically mentioning Benny's Burgers as the last place they were spotted. One name, in particular, caught Emma's eye: David Carter, a young drifter who had been backpacking across the country. According to the article, David had been seen at Benny's diner the night before he disappeared, and the police report mentioned he had ordered the famous Benny's Special. Despite a thorough search, no trace of him was ever found. Emma's mind raced as she pieced together the information. Could it be possible that Benny was involved in these disappearances? The thought seemed absurd, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. She decided to take a closer look at the police reports. After a bit of asking around, she managed to get in touch with a retired local officer, Tom Wilkins, who had worked on some of the missing persons cases. Tom was in his 70s now, living a quiet life on the outskirts of town. But he agreed to meet Emma and share what he remembered. When Emma arrived at Tom's modest home, she was greeted by a grizzled man with kind eyes that had clearly seen too much in his lifetime. Over cups of strong coffee, Tom began to recount his experience working on the cases. "Those disappearances still haunt me," Tom admitted, his voice low and weary. "We never found a single body, not a shred of evidence. It was like these people just vanished, but I always had my suspicions. Emma leaned in, her curiosity piqued. What do you mean? Suspicions about who? Tom hesitated for a moment, then sighed. Benny Thompson, that man, there's something not right about him. We never had enough to go on, just gut feelings and whispers. But I always thought he knew more than he let on. The problem was, he was so well liked in town. No one wanted to believe anything bad about him. And without evidence, my hands were tied. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. Did you ever confront him? Tom nodded slowly. I did once. I asked him straight out if he knew anything about the disappearances. He looked me dead in the eye and said, You're barking up the wrong tree, officer. I've got nothing to do with it. And that was that. But the way he said it, I never could forget it. Emma thanked Tom for his time and left with more questions than answers. She knew she had to find a way to uncover the truth. But the more she learned, the more dangerous it seemed. Benny was clearly not someone to be underestimated, and if he was involved, exposing him could be perilous. Determined to find out more, Emma decided to visit the local butcher, a man named Greg, who supplied meat to most of the town's eateries, including Benny's diner. She figured if anyone knew anything about the source of Benny's meat, it would be Greg. The butcher shop was a stark contrast to the cheerful diner. It was dark and cold, with the smell of raw meat hanging heavy in the air. Greg was a burly man with a stern expression, busy at work when Emma walked in. She introduced herself and asked a few casual questions about the meat industry in Blue Ridge, eventually steering the conversation toward Benny's Burgers. Benny? Yeah, I supply him with the usual. Beef, pork, chicken, same as everyone else, Greg said, wiping his hands on his blood-stained apron. He's a picky customer, though. Real particular about what he wants. Emma tried to dig deeper. Has he ever requested anything unusual? Special cuts or types of meat? Greg paused, narrowing his eyes. Why do you ask? Emma hesitated, then decided to go for it. I'm working on a story about the history of Blue Ridge, and Benny's Diner is a big part of that. I'm just curious if there's anything unique about the meat he uses. People always talk about how special it tastes. Greg's face darkened. Look, lady, I don't know what you're getting at, but Benny's business is his own. I supply him with what he orders, and that's it. If you're trying to stir up trouble, you won't find any here. Emma realized she had hit a nerve and decided to back off. She thanked Greg and left the shop, but the conversation only fueled her suspicions. If Benny was using the same meat as everyone else, what made his burgers so different? And why was Greg so defensive? As Emma walked back to her car, she noticed a black truck parked across the street. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Trying to remain calm, she got into her car and drove back to her motel, checking her rearview mirror every few minutes. The truck followed her for a while, but eventually turned off onto a side road. Back in her motel room, Emma tried to collect her thoughts. She was getting closer to the truth, but the closer she got, the more dangerous it became. Someone didn't want her asking questions, and she had a sinking feeling that Benny was aware of her investigation. Despite the fear gnawing at her, Emma knew she couldn't stop now. She was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. But as night fell, and the shadows lengthened, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The small town of Blue Ridge, once charming and quaint, now felt like a prison with unseen eyes tracking her every move. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Emma's mind raced with possibilities. What was Benny hiding? And more importantly, How far would he go to protect his secret? Little did she know, the answers were much darker than she could have ever imagined. The morning sun broke over Blue Ridge, casting long shadows across the town that seemed to deepen the sense of unease Emma felt. The events of the previous day had left her shaken, but she knew she was close to uncovering something truly dark, and she couldn't turn back now. Determined to push forward, she planned her next move carefully. Emma decided that her best chance of getting closer to the truth was to approach someone who had been close to Benny in the past. She had learned from her research that Benny once had a business partner, a man named Harold Grayson, who had mysteriously left town about 10 years ago. Some locals mentioned Harold in passing, but details were scarce, and no one seemed to know where he had gone. After a few calls and some online digging, Emma tracked Harold down to a small town a few hours away. He had opened a modest butcher shop, far from the prying eyes of Blue Ridge. Emma sensed that Harold might hold the key to the mystery, so she decided to pay him a visit. The drive to Harold's town was tense. Emma kept glancing in her rearview mirror, half expecting to see the black truck from the day before. But the road remained empty, and she eventually arrived at Harold's shop without incident. The shop was small and unremarkable, with a faded sign that simply read, "Grayson's Meats." Emma entered the shop, the bell above the door jangling softly. Harold, a grizzled man in his late 50s, looked up from behind the counter. His eyes, once sharp, now seemed tired and wary. He greeted her with a curt nod. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gruff. Emma introduced herself and explained that she was writing a story about Blue Ridge and Benny's Burgers. As soon as she mentioned Benny's name, she saw a flicker of recognition, and perhaps fear, in Harold's eyes. "Benny Thompson, huh?" Harold muttered, more to himself than to her. He seemed to wrestle with something internally before he finally spoke again. "What do you want to know about him?" "I've been looking into the disappearances in Blue Ridge," Emma said carefully. "A lot of them seem to be connected to Benny's diner. I think there's something more going on, and I believe you might know what that is." Harold let out a long sigh and leaned against the counter, rubbing his temples. "You're digging into something that should have been left buried," he said quietly. "But I suppose you wouldn't be here if you weren't serious." Emma remained silent, letting Harold continue at his own pace. "Benny and we started that diner together," Harold began. "Back then, it was just a small place, nothing like what it became. We were struggling to make ends meet, and Benny was desperate. One day, he told me he had a way to turn things around, said he had a new recipe that would make us the talk of the town. He was always a good cook, but this was different." Harold paused, as if trying to find the right words. "The meat he brought in was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It tasted incredible, but there was something off about it. I asked him where he got it, but he just gave me that look, the one that made you feel like you didn't want to know the answer." Emma's heart raced as she listened. "What was it, Harold? What kind of meat was it?" Harold's face turned pale. "I don't know for sure, but I started hearing rumors. People were saying that some of the missing folks had been seen near our diner. I confronted Benny, but he just laughed it off. Told me to keep my mouth shut if I knew what was good for me. That's when I left. I couldn't stay there, not knowing what we were serving." Emma felt a cold chill run down her spine. "Do you think Benny was using human meat?" Harold didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to a locked drawer behind the counter, pulled out a key, and opened it. From inside, he retrieved an old yellowed notebook and handed it to Emma. "This is the ledger from the early days of the diner," Harold said. "You'll see the purchases we made, the meat we bought, But there are entries that don't make sense, deliveries that don't match anything on record, amounts that don't add up. I always suspected Benny had another supplier, someone off the books, but I never could prove it. Emma took the ledger, her hands trembling slightly. Why didn't you go to the police? I thought about it, Harold replied, his voice filled with regret. But Benny, he had too much power in that town. Everyone loved him, and I didn't have enough proof. And honestly, I was scared. Benny's not the kind of man you cross lightly. Emma thanked Harold and left the shop, the ledger clutched tightly in her hands. As she drove back to Blue Ridge, her mind raced with possibilities. If Benny had been using human meat in his burgers, it would explain the disappearances and the rumors that had circulated for years. But she still needed concrete evidence, something that would tie Benny directly to the crimes. Back in Blue Ridge, Emma returned to her motel and began poring over the ledger. The entries were cryptic, with only initials and vague descriptions of the meat purchased. But one thing stood out. Several large deliveries were marked with the initials MP, which didn't correspond to any supplier she knew of. She made a note to investigate further. That night, as Emma sat at her desk, there was a sudden knock on her motel room door. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. Cautiously, she approached the door and peered through the peephole. To her surprise, it was Marge, the waitress from Benny's diner. Emma opened the door slightly, her guard up. Marge, what are you doing here? Marge looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder as if she were afraid of being followed. I had to talk to you, she whispered. I've been thinking about what you asked me, about the meat. There's something you need to know, but I can't talk here. Meet me at the old lumberyard on the edge of town in an hour. And please, don't tell anyone. Before Emma could respond, Marge turned and hurried away into the night. Emma knew she was walking into something dangerous, but she also knew she couldn't back down now. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, and Marge might be the key to unlocking the whole truth. As the hour passed, Emma prepared herself for the meeting, feeling a growing sense of dread. She drove to the old lumberyard, a desolate place that had been abandoned for years. The moon cast eerie shadows across the dilapidated buildings as she parked her car and got out, scanning the area for any sign of Marge. The place was silent, save for the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. Emma walked cautiously through the yard, her footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. Finally, she spotted Marge standing near an old storage shed, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. Marge? Emma called out softly. Marge turned to face her, but before she could say a word, there was a sudden, sharp crack, a gunshot. Marge's body jerked, and she collapsed to the ground. Emma screamed, her instincts kicking in as she dove behind a nearby stack of lumber. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to comprehend what had just happened. Someone had been waiting for them, someone who didn't want Marge to talk. Emma peeked out from behind the lumber, but she couldn't see anyone. She needed to get out of there before whoever shot Marge came after her next. Emma crawled back to her car, staying as low as possible. Once inside, she fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and she sped out of the lumberyard, her mind reeling with fear and adrenaline. She had come so close to getting the truth, but now Marge was dead, and whoever was behind it was still out there. As Emma drove through the empty streets of Blue Ridge, she knew that she was in way over her head. The dark secret of Benny's Burgers was more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And now she was next on the list. Emma's car sped through the dark streets of Blue Ridge, her heart pounding as she tried to process what had just happened. Marge was dead, shot down before she could reveal the truth about Benny's burgers. The realization that someone was willing to kill to keep the secret buried sent a wave of terror through her. She was now deeply entangled in a deadly game, and the stakes had just been raised. As she drove, Emma's mind raced. She needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere she could regroup and figure out her next move. Her first thought was to go to the police, but she quickly dismissed the idea. If Benny had the kind of influence Harold had hinted at, the local police might be compromised. She couldn't trust anyone in this town. She decided to drive out of Blue Ridge and find a motel in a neighboring town, far enough away that she could disappear for a while and think. But as she approached the edge of town, she noticed headlights in her rearview mirror, bright and unwavering, closing in fast. Panic gripped her as she realized she was being followed. Emma pressed down on the accelerator, trying to put as much distance as possible between her and the car behind her. But the other driver matched her speed, tailing her relentlessly. She took a sharp turn down a side road, hoping to lose them in the winding back roads. But the car followed, its headlights casting long shadows that seemed to chase her. She knew she had to shake them off, but her options were limited. The road ahead twisted through dense forest, with no signs of civilization in sight. Her only hope was to outmaneuver her pursuer. Gritting her teeth, Emma took another sharp turn, this time onto a narrow gravel road that led deeper into the woods. The car behind her hesitated for a moment, then followed. The gravel crunched under her tires as she sped down the winding path, the trees closing in around her like walls. The road was uneven and treacherous, and she fought to keep control of the car as it skidded around tight corners. But the other driver was determined, staying on her tail with a persistence that filled her with dread. Up ahead, Emma spotted a small clearing with an old, dilapidated cabin. It was barely visible in the darkness, but it was her only chance. She slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop in front of the cabin. Without a second thought, she jumped out of the car and sprinted toward the door, praying it wasn't locked. The door gave way under her weight, and she stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind her. She fumbled in the darkness, searching for something, anything, that she could use to barricade the door. Her hands found an old wooden chair, and she wedged it under the doorknob just as she heard the sound of footsteps approaching outside. Emma backed away from the door, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She was trapped, with no way out. The only light in the cabin came from the moon filtering through the cracks in the walls, casting eerie shadows across the room. She could hear the crunch of gravel as her pursuer approached, and then silence. For a moment, Emma thought they might have given up. But then the door rattled violently as someone tried to force it open. The chair held, but she knew it wouldn't for long. She scanned the room, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. Her eyes landed on an old, rusted hunting knife lying on a dusty table. She grabbed it, holding it tightly in her trembling hands. The door rattled again, harder this time, and she could hear the wood creaking under the pressure. Whoever was outside wasn't going to stop until they got in. Emma backed into a corner, her heart pounding in her ears, and waited for the inevitable. Suddenly, the door burst open with a loud crack, and a tall figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the moonlight. Emma could only make out the shape of the person, broad shoulders, a heavy build, but she couldn't see their face. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. "Who are you?" Emma demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they took another step forward, their presence filling the small cabin. Emma's grip tightened on the knife, her knuckles white. She knew she didn't stand a chance against this person, but she wasn't going to go down without a fight. As the figure moved closer, the moonlight caught the edge of something metallic in their hand, a gun. Emma's heart sank. She was outmatched in every way. But just as the figure raised the gun, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, growing louder by the second. The figure hesitated, glancing back toward the door. Taking advantage of the distraction, Emma lunged forward with the knife, aiming for the figure's arm. The blade connected, and she heard a grunt of pain as the person staggered back. Blood dripped from the wound, but it wasn't enough to incapacitate them. The figure turned back to her, anger radiating from their stance. But the sirens were getting closer, and the figure knew they were out of time. With a final menacing glare at Emma, they turned and bolted out the door, disappearing into the night. Emma collapsed to the floor, the adrenaline leaving her weak and shaking. Moments later, a police car screeched to a halt outside the cabin, and 2 officers rushed in, guns drawn. They found Emma on the floor, clutching the bloody knife, her face pale and her body trembling. "Are you all right, ma'am?" one of the officers asked, kneeling beside her. Emma nodded weakly, still in shock from the encounter. They tried to kill me," she whispered. The officers exchanged glances, then helped Emma to her feet. They quickly secured the area, but there was no sign of the person who had attacked her. Whoever it was, they had vanished into the woods, leaving behind only a trail of blood that led to the edge of the clearing before disappearing entirely. Emma was taken to the local hospital for treatment, and the police began an investigation. But as she sat in the hospital bed, replaying the events in her mind, she knew that this wasn't over. Whoever was behind the disappearances and Marge's murder was still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had silenced her for good. But Emma was no longer just a journalist seeking a story. She was a survivor, and she was determined to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. The ledger she had found in Harold's shop was still in her possession, and she knew it held the key to unraveling the mystery. But she needed help, someone she could trust to help her decipher the cryptic entries and connect the dots. As she lay in the hospital bed, Emma made a decision. She would reach out to Tom Wilkins, the retired police officer who had once investigated the disappearances. He had warned her about Benny, and she was sure he could help her now. Together, they might be able to bring down the twisted operation behind Benny's Burgers and finally uncover the truth. But time was running out, and the shadowy figure who had attacked her was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Emma knew she had to act fast before the next attempt on her life succeeded. Emma's wounds were superficial, but the encounter had left deeper scars on her psyche. The hospital bed felt like a temporary sanctuary, a brief reprieve from the darkness that had overtaken her life. But she knew she couldn't stay there forever. The danger was still looming, and the longer she waited, the closer it crept. The next morning, after being discharged from the hospital, Emma drove straight to Tom Wilkins' home. The retired officer had agreed to meet her after she told him about the attack. Tom had a reputation as a straight shooter, someone who had always been deeply concerned about the unsolved disappearances in Blue Ridge. Emma hoped he still had the determination to seek justice, even after all these years. Tom's home was a modest house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by tall pine trees that whispered in the wind. Emma parked in the gravel driveway and made her way to the front door. Tom greeted her with a grim expression, his weathered face showing the toll that years of worry had taken on him. "Come on in, Emma," he said, holding the door open for her. "I've got coffee brewing." Inside, the house was cozy but cluttered, with old case files and newspaper clippings strewn across the dining table. It was clear that Tom had never stopped thinking about the disappearances, even in his retirement. As they sat down with steaming mugs of coffee, Emma pulled out the ledger she had taken from Harold's shop. "This is what I found," Emma said, sliding the ledger across the table to Tom. "It's from the early days of Benny's Diner. There are some strange entries here, deliveries that don't match up with anything on record. I think this might be the key to understanding what Benny's been doing all these years." Tom flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing as he studied the cryptic notes and initials. "MP," he muttered under his breath. "These initials keep showing up, but who or what does MP stand for?" Emma leaned forward, her voice tense. "That's what we need to find out. I'm sure it's connected to the disappearances. If we can figure out what MP means, we might be able to trace it back to Benny's supplier, or whatever operation he's running." Tom nodded, deep in thought. It could be a name, or it could be a location, someplace where Benny was getting his meat. But why would he keep it off the books? Unless... His voice trailed off as a grim realization dawned on him. "Unless it was human meat," Emma finished, her stomach turning at the thought. Tom sighed heavily. "It's a horrifying possibility, but we have to consider it. I'll reach out to some old contacts, see if anyone remembers anything about these initials, or if there were any connections we might have missed back then." As Tom got up to make some phone calls, Emma continued to pore over the ledger. She noticed that the entries for MP deliveries often coincided with the dates of the disappearances she had researched. It was as if the disappearances and the deliveries were part of the same pattern, a pattern that had gone unnoticed for far too long. An hour later, Tom returned with a solemn expression. "I've got something. An old colleague of mine who worked in forensics remembers the initials MP from a cold case years ago. It was tied to a place called Maple Pines, a small meat processing plant that was shut down about 15 years ago for unsanitary conditions. It was located just outside of Blue Ridge." "Maple Pines?" Emma repeated, feeling a chill run down her spine. "That could be where Benny was getting his special meat." Tom nodded. "It's possible. But if that plant's been closed for so long, why would the deliveries continue? Unless Benny found another way to keep the supply coming." Emma's mind raced as she considered the implications. What if Benny took over the operation after it was shut down? He could have kept it running in secret, using it as a front for something much darker. Tom's expression grew even more serious. "If that's the case, we're dealing with something far worse than we imagined. We need to go to Maple Pines and see if we can find any evidence." Emma agreed, and they quickly made plans to visit the old plant. But they knew they had to be cautious. If Benny or anyone connected to him suspected that they were closing in on the truth, they could be walking into a trap. The drive to Maple Pines was tense. The plant was located deep in the woods, far from any main roads. The area had been abandoned for years, and the overgrown vegetation and dilapidated buildings gave it an eerie, foreboding atmosphere. As Emma and Tom approached, they could see the crumbling sign that once read Maple Pines Meat Processing hanging precariously from a rusted pole. They parked a short distance away and approached the plant on foot, careful to stay hidden in the shadows. The main building loomed before them, its windows broken and its walls covered in graffiti. But despite its outward appearance, there was something unsettling about the place, something that made Emma's skin crawl. Tom motioned for Emma to stay close as they made their way around the perimeter, searching for a way inside. They found a side door that had been forced open, the lock broken. Tom drew his flashlight and nodded to Emma, signaling that they were going in. The inside of the plant was even more disturbing than the outside. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the walls were stained with old blood. The equipment, long since abandoned, was covered in dust and rust, but it was clear that at some point it had been used recently. They moved cautiously through the dark corridors, their footsteps echoing on the cold concrete floors. Emma's heart raced as she imagined the horrors that might have taken place here. Tom led the way, his flashlight sweeping over the walls and floor, searching for any sign of recent activity. As they reached the back of the plant, they found a large, reinforced door with a heavy padlock. Tom knelt down to examine it, his face grim. "This wasn't here when the plant was shut down," he said. "Someone's been keeping this place secure." Emma's mind raced. "Can you get it open?" Tom nodded, pulling a set of lock-picking tools from his jacket. He worked quickly, and within minutes, the lock clicked open. Emma's breath caught in her throat as Tom slowly pushed the door open, revealing a set of stairs leading down into darkness. They exchanged a look, knowing that whatever lay beneath the plant was likely the answer to all the questions they had been asking. With a deep breath, they descended the stairs, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a large, underground room. The walls were lined with freezers and metal tables, and in the center of the room was a large, industrial meat grinder. Emma's stomach churned as she took in the sight. This was no ordinary meat processing plant. This was a slaughterhouse. Tom shone his flashlight around the room, and that's when they saw it. A pile of bones, neatly stacked in the corner, picked clean and bleached white. Emma's hand flew to her mouth as she fought the urge to scream. The truth was undeniable now. Benny had been using human meat in his burgers, and this was where it had all happened. But before they could react, the sound of footsteps echoed from above. Someone was coming down the stairs, someone who knew they were there. "Quick, hide," Tom whispered urgently, pulling Emma behind one of the large freezers. They crouched in the shadows, holding their breath as the footsteps grew louder. A figure appeared at the top of the stairs, descending slowly into the room. As the person stepped into the light, Emma's blood ran cold. It was Benny. He moved with a calm, methodical precision, completely unaware that he was not alone. Benny approached the meat grinder and inspected it, his expression cold and detached. Then he began to hum a tune, something that sounded like an old country song, as he worked on cleaning the machine. Emma's mind raced. They needed to get out of there and alert the authorities, but if Benny discovered them, they were as good as dead. Tom motioned for Emma to stay put while he reached for his phone to call for help. But as Tom fumbled with the phone, it slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor. The sound echoed through the room, and Benny froze, his humming stopping abruptly. "Who's there?" Benny's voice was low, dangerous. He grabbed a large butcher knife from one of the tables and began to scan the room, his eyes narrowing. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as Benny took slow, deliberate steps toward their hiding spot. They were trapped, and Benny was closing in fast. There was no way out. As Benny approached, Tom sprang from behind the freezer, tackling him to the ground. The two men struggled fiercely, the knife clattering away on the concrete floor. Emma watched in horror as Benny, despite his age, fought with terrifying strength. Tom shouted for Emma to run, but she couldn't leave him behind. Instead, she grabbed the nearest weapon, a heavy metal pipe, and swung it with all her might, hitting Benny across the back. He cried out in pain, giving Tom the opening he needed to subdue him. They quickly tied Benny up with a length of rope they found in the room. Tom, breathing heavily, looked at Emma with a mix of relief and exhaustion. "We need to get out of here now." But as they turned to leave, Benny began to laugh, a low, menacing sound that sent shivers down Emma's spine. "You think this is over?" Benny sneered, his eyes gleaming with madness. "There are more of us than you can imagine. You'll never stop it." Emma and Tom exchanged a worried glance, realizing the implications of Benny's words. This was bigger than just one man. There was a network behind the disappearances, and Benny was only a part of it. As they hauled Benny to his feet and began to lead him out of the plant, Emma knew they had uncovered something far darker than they had ever anticipated. The horrors of Blue Ridge were just the beginning, and the true scope of the operation was yet to be revealed. But for now, they had a lead, a way to bring down the twisted operation and finally expose the truth behind Benny's Burgers. They just had to stay alive long enough to do it. Emma and Tom drove through the night, with Benny tied up in the back seat, unconscious from the struggle. They had made it out of Maple Pines, but the sense of unease lingered in the air. Benny's words echoed in Emma's mind. There were more of them, a network that went far beyond what they had uncovered. The truth was far darker and more expansive than they had imagined. They arrived at a secluded cabin deep in the woods, a safe house Tom had prepared in case things went south. It was off the grid, far from prying eyes, and it gave them time to figure out their next move. Tom parked the car behind the cabin, and they dragged Benny inside, securing him to a heavy wooden chair in the center of the room. As dawn broke, Benny began to stir, his eyes opening slowly. He took in his surroundings with a cold, calculating gaze, his demeanor eerily calm given the circumstances. "You've really stepped in it now," Benny said, a twisted smile creeping across his face. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you're up against." Tom leaned in close, his voice low and threatening. "We're done with your games, Benny. You're going to tell us everything, who you're working with, how deep this goes, and what you've done to all those people." Benny chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down Emma's spine. "You can torture me, kill me if you want, but it won't change a thing. There's no stopping this. We've been at it for years, right under your noses, and you never even suspected. What makes you think you can stop us now?" Emma stepped forward, her voice steady but laced with anger. "We're going to make sure this ends here, Benny. You're going to pay for everything you've done, and we're going to bring down every last person involved in this sick operation." Benny's smile widened, his eyes glinting with something close to admiration. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're in way over your head. Even if you take me down, there are others, more powerful, more dangerous than you can imagine. They'll come for you, and when they do, there won't be anything left." Tom and Emma exchanged a glance, the gravity of Benny's words sinking in. They knew they were dealing with something much larger than a single man, but they were determined to see it through to the end. "Start talking," Tom demanded, his patience wearing thin. "Who's involved? How far does this go?" For a moment, it seemed like Benny might refuse, but then something shifted in his eyes, a realization that perhaps he was beaten after all. He sighed, the fight seemingly draining out of him. "Fine," he said, his voice lowering to a menacing whisper. "But remember, you asked for this." Benny began to speak, revealing a web of corruption and horror that stretched across the region. The network wasn't just about human meat. It was about power, control, and the darkest corners of human nature. Wealthy individuals from across the country, people in positions of power, were involved. They paid top dollar for Benny's special meat, knowing full well where it came from. The operation had started small, but as demand grew, so did the scope of their activities. Benny explained that Maple Pines had been the hub for their gruesome enterprise, but it was only one of several locations where the processing took place. The people who disappeared were carefully chosen: drifters, the homeless, those who wouldn't be missed. They were lured in, and once they were gone, their identities were erased, their bodies turned into the secret ingredient that made Benny's Burgers famous. As Benny spoke, Emma felt a cold rage building inside her. The scale of the atrocities committed was unimaginable, and the fact that so many had been complicit in it made her sick to her core. But she also knew they had the information they needed to bring it all down. When Benny finished, Tom stepped back, shaking his head in disgust. "You're a monster, Benny, and so are the people who supported you." Benny smirked, his eyes gleaming with defiance. "Maybe so, but they're monsters with power. You think you can just expose this and walk away? They'll hunt you down, kill you before you get the chance." Emma knew he was right. They were in real danger now. But she also knew they couldn't back down. They had to act quickly and decisively if they were going to stop this network. "We need to get this to the FBI," Emma said, her voice firm. "They're the only ones who can take this down at the federal level. But we have to be smart about it. If we go to the wrong people, we could be silenced before we even make it to a safe house." Tom agreed. They carefully recorded Benny's confession, ensuring they had multiple copies stored securely. Then, they made the call to the nearest FBI field office, arranging a secret meeting to hand over the evidence. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig outside made her heart race. She knew Benny's network was powerful, and they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate threats. They loaded Benny into the car, and as they drove toward the meeting point, the tension in the car was palpable. The roads were empty, the early morning light casting long shadows that seemed to follow them. Finally, they arrived at a remote location where the FBI agents were waiting. Emma and Tom handed over the evidence, detailing everything Benny had confessed. The agents were stunned by the scale of the operation and immediately promised to launch a full investigation. As they took Benny into custody, the lead agent turned to Emma and Tom. "You've done the right thing, but you need to be careful. This isn't over. We'll do everything we can to protect you, but these people, they don't go down easily." Emma nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. She and Tom had exposed something monstrous, but they knew the fight wasn't over. They would have to stay vigilant, knowing that they had made powerful enemies. In the days that followed, news of the operation began to spread. Arrests were made, and the truth about Benny's Burgers shocked the nation. The once beloved diner became a symbol of horror, and Blue Ridge was thrust into the spotlight as the epicenter of a nightmare that had gone unnoticed for years. But for Emma and Tom, there was no time to celebrate. They knew they had to stay on the move, always looking over their shoulders. The people they had exposed were dangerous, and they wouldn't rest until they had exacted their revenge. Yet, despite the fear and the uncertainty, Emma felt a sense of grim satisfaction. They had done what was right. They had brought justice to the victims, and they had exposed the darkness that had festered for so long. As they drove away from Blue Ridge, leaving the town and its horrors behind, Emma knew that life would never be the same. But she also knew that she had faced the abyss and survived, and for now, that was enough. Epilogue. Months later, Emma sat in a quiet cafe in a city far from Blue Ridge, sipping coffee and reading the news. The headlines told the story of a massive federal crackdown on the criminal network exposed by Benny's confession. Dozens of high-profile arrests had been made, and the FBI was continuing to unravel the web of corruption. She knew the danger wasn't entirely gone. There were still people out there who would want to silence her. But she had taken precautions, changed her identity, and stayed off the radar. She and Tom remained in contact, always ready to move if necessary. As she finished her coffee and prepared to leave, Emma felt a sense of closure. The nightmare of Blue Ridge was behind her, but its lessons would stay with her forever. She had looked into the darkest corners of humanity and lived to tell the tale. And though she knew the world was still full of shadows, she also knew that, in the end, the truth had prevailed. With that thought, Emma stepped out of the cafe and disappeared into the bustling city, leaving the past behind and walking toward an uncertain but hopeful future.